Right, hello there, friends. Welcome back to Hawkeye Speaks. Today we'll be reading a little bit, as well as discussing a few things. We are reading from Mae-Wan Ho's Meaning of Life in the Universe. And it would take quite a while to read you the entire essays, so I'm picking up here about 2/3 of the way through this one called Natural Being and Coherent Society. And she's speaking about love and science, that the real purpose of science is to formulate this intimate connection with nature. So, we're in good company here. Nature from within. To know nature from within is to recover the indigenous natural wisdom that sees nature as she really is, the evolving plenitude that affords the existence of things, the source and sustenance of all life, and the ultimate inspiration for the human consciousness striving to know and to create. In a culture that has lost none of this feeling of real participation in nature's creative process, science, as much as art, is the quest for greater intimacy with nature that involves our whole being. The ideal state of true knowledge and inspiration is a state of total quantum coherence with nature in which the knower and the known are mutually transparent. In ancient China, this entails the spiritual union of the knower with the Tao, the creative principle that generates the multiplicity of things. As the Tao is eternal, the knower partakes in the eternal, all things through the Tao. The knower partakes of the eternal in all things through the Tao. Similarly, in ancient Greece, true knowledge was regarded as the unobscured participation in the divine mind from which all creation springs. In this quantum coherent state, one's actions are guided not by disembodied objective intellect, but on the contrary by a passionate, total involvement and harmony of mind and body in nature. The feeling for the unity and interconnectedness of nature is not just a romantic notion entertained by poets and mystics and the so-called primitive consciousness. It is a universal intuitive insight that contemporary science is driven to validate in all respects. In biology, by far the most tenaciously held dogma for the whole of the present century is that the genes of organisms are immune from our environmental exigencies and are passed on practically unchanged to the next generation. Since the mid 70s, however, as the tools of molecular genetics have become more and more precise, people have begun to discover that the genes can change as readily as many other characteristics of the organism in response to the external environment. So much so that molecular geneticists have coined the term the fluid genome to describe the large variety of processes that can chop and change the genes and expand or shrink different parts of the genetic material. Excuse me. Recent experiments also indicate that adaptive genetic mutations are non-random, in that they are much more likely to occur than non-adaptive ones. All the evidence indicates that organism and environment are intimately connected, from the sociocultural domain right down to the genes. Stable inheritance depends on this very interconnection. Rather than on mythical unchangeable genomes, the process of heritability has a dynamic stability that resides in the feedback into relationships that can propagate from the external environment through the physiological system to the genes. Organism and environment, like figure and ground, engage in ceaseless rounds of mutual definition and transformation, which is the essence of evolution. Cycles of feedback between the biosphere and the physiochemical environment are the basis of stability for the global ecosystem. The present global environmental crisis is the direct consequence of a knowledge system based on a denial of the unity of nature. And nature is responding loud and clear. She is one indivisible ecosystem. Whatever insult is perpetrated in one part of the planet will have repercussions, not only locally, but globally. British space scientist James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis encapsulates the ancient ecological wisdom in contemporary form. And I'll have to stop there and say that I don't know if Mae-Wan Ho disliked Margulis and Margulis disliked Mae-Wan Ho, but you know how women are a little bit touchy with each other at times. It's very interesting to me that Mae-Wan Ho does mention Lovelock, but I've never once heard her mention Margulis. They'll never, mention each other in any of their writings one bit, but it is impossible to me to imagine that at least towards the end of their lives they were not at least familiar with each other. Okay. And Margulis and Lovelock both were not fans of the Greens, they called them, which is the environmentalists. So that's just something to quickly note here is that, when Mae-Wan Ho's talking about the environmental crisis, she very much knew that the thermodynamics of societies is much more complex, and involves interconnected systems than just some simple metric of atmospheric carbon content. As well as, of course, this was the basis of biospheric geophysiology, aka the Gaia theory, is that all of these conditions that we experience that make up the living conditions of the planet, which we call the climate, are made possible and regulated by living organisms. So this is much, much, much more complex than humans burned fossil fuels and created atmospheric carbon and now the planet's warming. That is such a reductionist mechanistic stance that is nowhere near anything like what Lovelock and Margulis were talking about. The Gaia hypothesis encapsulates the ancient ecological wisdom in a contemporary form. The collective activities of the biosphere as a whole maintain Earth's atmosphere and temperature far away from the thermodynamic equilibrium in conditions that are fit for life. Instead, every individual organism, working for its own selfish ends, as envisaged in the neo-Darwinian theory, it is the extent to which they effectively cooperate in cycles of mutual feedback and interdependency that life for all is possible. Okay, so she's directly saying that neo-Darwinian survival of the fittest doesn't provide for the mechanisms that create the holobiont, the holism of the environment. It's just how when we start with first principles in physics, if we start with strong force, weak force, electromagnetism, entropy is the law, you could never actually create anything, much less speciation. You can't build anything with degenerative principles. So again, Mae-Wan Ho saw very deeply into these elements to such an extent that this is, I would have to guess, a large portion of why her work has been ignored or not as understood as deeply as possibly it could and should have been. This is a generalization of the principle of mutual aid among animals and plants known that Kropotkin and Ali have dwelt on. Of course, Peter Kropotkin famously wrote Mutual Aid as well as Ethics in the mid 20th century, I believe, not too long ago. More importantly, organisms are not so much passively adapted to the environment by natural selection as actively adapting the environment to themselves. In other words, organisms actively participate in shaping their own evolution. This arises naturally through the interconnections not just between all life forms, but also between the biological and the physical realms, each shaping the other in successive rounds of mutual transformation and regeneration. Every species is endowed with powers that are given by all the rest. In a very real sense, each is implicated in the other by the material and energy flow, and also the flow of information, as we shall see. There is an irreducible wholeness of being and becoming on Earth. This wholeness encompasses our relationship to nature at the most fundamental and physical level. The universal wholeness of being and becoming is most clearly brought home to us in quantum physics. Quantum physics is the culmination of a long series of attempts to fragment reality into the smallest particle. Only when physicists got down to the infinitesimal, indivisible quantum did they find that the whole exercise was futile, for it cannot be done at all. It turns out that in order to have a consistent representation or theory, it must be supposed that the observer and observed are one indivisible system, and that the very act of observation transforms reality into an indefiniteness of multiple superimposed potentialities of being to a state of definiteness, which, however, cannot be predicted in advance. Moreover, the same act of observation can simultaneously determine the state of an entity widely separated from the one observed, as though reality were indeed an organic universal whole. Theoretical physicist David Bohm and colleagues have reformulated quantum theory on the basis of this universal wholeness. Every particle or being is embedded in a field, or super quantum potential, due to every other particle in the entire universe. From this perspective, wholeness and interconnectedness are actual and primary, while fragmentation and separation are illusory. Nature has neglected Nature has negated all attempts to describe her simplistically, in terms of a flat, common-sensible literalness. The reductionist atomistic science, whose aim it was to do just that, when pushed to the very limit, can only reaffirm that reality has breadths and depths beyond our comprehension or description. As our knowledge of nature deepens, so too the magic and the mystery, the same magic and mystery our ancestors had access to. Nature is both wave and particle, both here and everywhere at the same time. To know her requires not only the analytic intellect of the scientist, but also the vision of the mystic, the imagination of the poet, and the sensitivity of the artist. It requires our undivided being participating fully in this knowledge. The coherence of being. I said that organisms may be interconnected with one another and with their physiochemical environment by information flow, as well as by material and energy flow. It is already generally accepted that physical parameters such as day length and other seasonal variables are informational, in that organisms respond to them physiologically. One hypothesis is that the biological rhythms are closely attuned to the rhythms of Earth, which are in turn attuned to those of the sun and the moon. Many of these natural rhythms are electromagnetic in nature. There is now substantial literature on the sensitivity of organisms to weak electric and magnetic fields occurring either naturally or close to power lines or other electrical appliances, although the mechanism involved in this sensitivity is not fully understood. Most molecular biologists assume that the answer to biological organization will come when all the molecules in organisms are isolated and analyzed. But biological organization is a dynamic, macroscopic order extending over astronomical numbers of molecules, spanning distances at least millions of times the size of individual molecules. This organization enables organisms to transform energy with a rapidity and efficiency rarely achieved elsewhere, if at all, and to be extremely sensitive to specific signals in the environment. The muscle contraction can be as efficient as 98% in converting chemical energy to mechanical work, and it is estimated that our eye is sensitive to a single quantum of light falling on the retina. In 1960, Nobel laureate biochemist Albert Szent-Györgyi pointed out that we not only begin to understand the characteristics of living systems if we take into account the collective properties of molecules akin to superconductivity and superfluidity. This idea was developed at about the same time by German-born British solid-state physicist Herbert Froelich, who suggested that living systems have collected modes of activity somewhat similar to superconductors operating at physiological temperatures. Metabolic energy, instead of being lost as heat, is stored in the form of collective or coherent electrochemical and electromagnetic excitations. These coherent excitations could be responsible for generating and maintaining long-range order. They also make possible highly efficient energy transfer and transformation of energy and the detection of very weak electromagnetic signals. Evidence for the existence of coherent excitations in living systems comes from the work of German quantum physicist and biophysicist Fritz Albert Popp and his co-workers, who showed that practically all organisms and cells emit light at very weak intensities. And just a note, Mae-Wan Ho does note that Fritz Albert Popp is her patron, her most important educator, scholar. What's the term? Or you know what I'm trying to say. Her dude. She loved Fritz Albert Popp. Organisms and cells also re-emit light at higher intensities as delayed luminescence after exposure to a brief pulse of light. As the result of some 15 years of experimental work, Popp became convinced that biophotons come from a coherent electrodynamical field within the living system. This field has a wide range of frequencies that are coupled together to give effectively a single degree of freedom, and that may be the basis of biological organization. Living systems are thus both emitters and receivers of electromagnetic signals, originating from the physiochemical environment as well as from other organisms. We have recently demonstrated, for example, that synchronously developing fruit fly embryos can interact nonlinearly to generate coherent light emissions that are orders of magnitude higher than the emission rate of individual embryos. We are left in no doubt that the organisms are interconnected by information flows as well as energy and material flow. And it's no small consequence that my grandfather studied fireflies as well as my great-grandfather studied bioluminescence. So here we are continuing the work, Mae-Wan Ho and the Institute for Science and Society, on our own behalf and yours as well. A key aspect of the quantum coherence is that it suggests a relationship between local and global, or individual and collective, that has been deemed contradictory or impossible within mechanistic perspectives. It turns out that a coherent field shows space-time correlations between different points that are precisely the products of self-correlations at those points. In other words, any number of points in a coherent field will behave statistically as though independent of one another, even though they are acting synergistically. A coherent state is thus one of maximum global cohesion and also maximum local freedom! Exclamation point. Maximum global cohesion and also maximum local freedom. The inevitable conflict between individual and collective, which serves as the starting point for all social as well as biological theories of Western society, is not so inevitable after all. Perhaps it's time for social theorists to adapt a new set of premises. Adopt, and adapt too, indeed. Let's see if we're still running here. All right, shall we continue with the coherent society? We're 18 minutes in. Takes a while to read if we blab a bit too, doesn't it? So, perhaps we'll break there, and then I'll read you the next section, the final section of this essay, Coherent Society, in the next segment. Thank you.